Hey there and welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to go over the 13 Fs for the super investors to check out what they've been buying and selling for the last quarter. Now, 13F is something you have to file when you manage over $100 million, which gives us an idea what the big guys are doing. This is something that I check every quarter to see if there's a new idea that I could clone from my favorite investors. In the video, we're going to be taking a look at some of my favorite investors like Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger and the portfolio he manages for the Daily Journal Corporation, and Lee Lu of Himalaya Capital, Mohnish Pabrai of Pabrai Funds, Guy Spier of Aquamarine Capital, and Terry Smith of Fundsmith, just to name a few. But before we start digging into the filings, I do want to ask you to smash the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. The first investor we're going to take a look at is Robert Vinall of RV Capital, which manages 327 million but only has 8 stocks, so he is pretty concentrated. If you take a look at his biggest holdings, he owns Meta, so he is a fellow shareholder in Meta, which is good to see. Apparently, he also has been buying into Pinduoduo, which is a Chinese company. I also remember when Robert Vinall bought into Carvana. I was pretty surprised to see that, seeing that I didn't really understand why he was buying it. And if we look at the activity, we can actually see that he bought first into Carvana in Q4 of 2021. And if we take a look at the prices of Carvana back in Q4 of 2021, they were $230 all the way up to about $300, with the current stock price being $35. So this was probably not a good investment for Rob, but only time will tell. Next up is my main man, Charles Thomas Munger, and he is the master of doing nothing with his portfolio, valued at about 158 million that he manages for the Daily Journal Corporation. Still only owns 4 stocks, which are 3 banks and then Alibaba. So he is a fellow Alibaba shareholder. And it's funny to look at the activity for Charlie for the last 10 years, where he has done almost nothing. Like he says himself, the best way to get rich is to sit on your assets. Here we have another master of doing nothing, Guy Spier of Aquamarine Capital, which has 12 stocks in his portfolio, valued at just over 200 million. And Guy's portfolio is highly concentrated in just a couple of stocks, with Berkshire Hathaway, American Express, MasterCard, Ferrari, and Bank of America making up the bulk of the portfolio. Guy is still holding Alibaba like me and Charlie, which is good to see. But Guy is still in Micron, which I was a little bit surprised to see, since I know that Mohnish Pabrai has sold out, and Lee Lu as well. And we can see here the activity of Guy and how he has mastered the art of doing nothing. Now, Mohnish Pabrai of Pabrai Investment is another investor that I like to track closely. Unfortunately, most of his investments are outside of the US, so we're not able to see his whole portfolio in Dataroma. We can, however, go to ticker.com to see what his portfolio really looks like. And his top holding is Reisas Logistics, which is a Turkish company. Reisas has been a total home run for Mohnish and has already been a multi-bagger for him for the last couple of years. But I remember watching a lot of videos with Mohnish Pabrai in about 2021, when he was talking about changing his investment approach after reading Nick Sleep's letters. In the videos, Pabrai talked about changing from being a deep value investor into an investor that invests only in quality companies. But Pabrai seems to have changed his ways already, seeing that his latest investment is in a company called Akre Resources. Now, Akre Resources is in the oil, gas, and consumable fuels industry, has a market cap of 2.8 billion and operates 7 active mines. So I don't think this is a company that he intends on keeping for the next 10 years. He is probably just buying it when it's low in the cycle, and once it goes up, he'll sell out. The next super investor that I track is called Chuck Akre of Akre Capital Management. I do believe that Chuck doesn't have an active role at the firm anymore, but the firm is still running according to his investment principles. And I really like Chuck's style of investment, which is really to buy high quality companies, pay a little bit more, but to hold them for a long time. And Chuck has had at least 200 baggers that I know of, with the first one being American Tower and the second one being Berkshire Hathaway. But as we can see here, they have almost sold completely out of Berkshire Hathaway. The fund invests in quality companies like MasterCard, Moody's, Visa, and O'Reilly's. I made a video about O'Reilly's main competitor the other day, AutoZone, and I came to the conclusion that O'Reilly's is actually a better company in my opinion. Now, as we can see here, Chuck Akre's fund sold completely out of Adobe in the quarter, which is not good news for me personally, since I own a stake in the company. Now, I'm never happy to see a super investor that I follow and respect exit a company, and that makes Chuck the second super investor that I know of to exit Adobe in a short period. Francois Rochon of Givney Capital is another super investor that I highly respect. I believe he holds about 25 companies in his main fund. I think he has three that you can choose from, but Givney Capital manages $1.8 billion, which is not a small sum. I have read all the Givney Capital letters to shareholders, and I would recommend them to everybody who wants to learn more about investing. Francois' biggest investment is in Berkshire Hathaway, which he has held for a long time, but he also invests in another insurance company called Markel Group, which is managed by Tom Gaynor. But if you go through the letters of Given, you can see that he likes home builders and banks a lot, and he has had a lot of them throughout the years. So I was pretty surprised to see him holding Lululemon, which doesn't seem to be a company that fits his style. The next super investor we're going to take a look at is Seth Klarman of Baupost Group, which has 31 stocks in his portfolio and manages about 5 billion of equities. I do think that Seth has more than 5 billion under management. He is investing in stuff like credit and distressed debt. So just looking at his stock portfolio doesn't give us the whole picture. And if we go over his portfolio, there are not a lot of names that I recognize. I see here that he's been buying into Dollar General, which I've seen a lot of investors selling out of. But Seth is a real contrarian and doesn't really care what other investors are doing. Seth is also a deep value guy, as you can see if you read his book, Margin of Safety, which I would recommend. In the third quarter, Seth also sold completely out of Amazon and Union Pacific, but I was really surprised to see him even invested in Amazon, where it doesn't seem to fit his investment style. Moving on to a lesser known investor called Greg Alexander of Conifer Management, which is super concentrated, which is something that we always like to see, and manages $887 million. Again, I don't really recognize most of the companies in his portfolio either, but I can see that 23% of his portfolio is invested in lithium motors, and I've seen that from more than one super investor. We can see here that David Abrams of Abrams Capital Management has 23% of his portfolio in lithium motors, along with Bill Nygren of the Oakmark Select Fund having 7% of his portfolio in the company. If you take a quick look at lithium motors at quickfs.net, it doesn't appear to be anything special other than just another car retailer. They are trading at a low PE, but their free cash flow is currently negative. The company has a low return on invested capital, and they have pretty low median margins, with the gross margin being 15% and their free cash flow margin being only 0.2% on average. The company seems to have a lot of debt on their balance sheet, with the debt to equity being 2.5. So this one is an investment that I will definitely not be copying. Prem Watsa is the next investor that we're going to look at, which manages Fairfax Financial Holdings. Prem is often referred to as the Warren Buffett of Canada and has a portfolio with $1.5 billion. Prem is an old school value guy, with 25% of his portfolio being invested in Occidental Petroleum and 17% in Micron. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I've seen at least two super investors that were invested in Micron exit the company in, I believe it was Q2 of 2023. Prem is a long-time shareholder in BlackBerry and has also been adding to his stake in a company called Orla Mining. I'm happy to see that Prem is a fellow shareholder in Alibaba. Now, this here just confirms the fact that Prem is an old school value investor where he is starting to build up his stake in United States Steel Corporation, which is something that I would probably never invest in personally. Now, switching from the Canadian Warren Buffett to the British Warren Buffett, Terry Smith of Fundsmith manages about $22 billion dollars. In his main fund, Fundsmith, he actually has about 25 companies, but this also shows us the smaller fund that is managed by one of his lieutenants called Smithson. And the biggest company that he has in his portfolio is Microsoft, which has been a great performer for the fund. He's also a fellow shareholder in Meta, which is good to see. And Terry has been building a stake in Fortinet, which is a company that I personally own and made my last video on. He did own Fortinet in his small fund, Smithson, but is now building a stake for Fundsmith. I was a little bit surprised to see that Terry completely exited Estee Lauder. I don't know what the reason for that was, maybe deteriorating fundamentals. Now, Michael Burry of Scion Asset Management is always a fun guy to watch, although I do have to admit that I don't understand what his investment strategy is. He only has 11 stocks in his portfolio, and it says here that the portfolio value is only $43 million, which seems a little bit low to me. It was only a short while ago that Michael Burry sold all of his stocks because he's always waiting for the next crash. He's been buying into three new companies this quarter, with the first one being Booking, and the second one being Alibaba, and the third one Alibaba's competitor, JD.com. If we go over his activity for the quarter and the last couple of quarters, we can see that Dr. Burry is quite busy at buying and selling, and it makes you wonder how high his transaction costs are. Clifford Sosin of CAS Investment Partners is one of those investors that is less known, but I like to track anyway. I always like to watch investors that are super concentrated, and Clifford only has 5 stocks in his portfolio, with the portfolio value being 780 million. His biggest holding, 36% of his total portfolio, is like we saw with Robert Vinall, Carvana. So with so much of Clifford's portfolio being invested in Carvana, it would be interesting to see the total return of the portfolio. The next super investor is David Tepper of Appaloosa Management, which has 32 stocks in his portfolio and manages over $5 billion. I'm happy to see that his top holding is Meta, with him also holding a stake in Alibaba. Now, he is also an investor in Pinduoduo, and he has been adding to his stake. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Trust is probably the second largest portfolio that I track, behind only the master himself, Warren Buffett of Berkshire Hathaway. And Bill's largest portfolio is, of course, Microsoft at 31%, with the second largest being Berkshire Hathaway at 20%, and the third largest Canadian National Railway at 15%. Now, as we can see here, it was a little bit weird that Bill was adding a lot of small stakes to his portfolio. And as we can see from previous quarters, Bill is usually not this active. So it would be interesting to know what he's up to. Norbert Lou of Punch Card Management is another super investor that is less known, but I like to keep track of his activity. He is super concentrated with only 5 stocks in his portfolio and a portfolio value of 340 million. At this point, he would probably be better off just to invest all of his money in Berkshire Hathaway, since it is over 50% of his portfolio, with the only two other meaningful positions being in Ally Financial and Winnebago Industries. Norbert Lou seems to have also mastered the art of doing nothing, as we can see from this data. Li Lu of Himalaya Capital Management is another one of my favorite super investors, which is super concentrated as well. And if we go to ticker.com, we can see that he actually has 7 companies in his portfolio, which is pretty concentrated, with over 30% being in the Postal Savings Bank of China. He also has two more banks, Bank of America and East West Bancorp, Berkshire Hathaway, Google, and Apple. So not a very complicated portfolio structure for Lilu. The next super investor is Dev Kantasaria of Valley Forge Capital, and I'm probably mispronouncing his name. Now, Dev is a super concentrated investor with only 8 stocks in his portfolio and a total value of just under $3 billion. You can see the theme of his portfolio is really in the financial sector, with his top holding being FICO and S&P Global, MasterCard, Moody's, and then Visa. Unfortunately, Dev is one of the investors that sold completely out of Adobe, which again is not good news for me personally. But he did, however, buy into ASML Holding, which is a company that I might have to look into. It is also interesting to see that Dev sold completely out of Amazon in Q1 of 2023, and he is just one of the many super investors that have exited Amazon. Now, last but not least, is the main man Warren Edward Buffett, with probably the biggest portfolio in the world of over $300 billion. Now, it says here that the portfolio contains 45 stocks, but if you look at the allocation, you can really see that the portfolio is heavily weighted towards the top, with Apple being over 50% of the portfolio, with a value of $156 billion. Now, Buffett has been buying heavily into oil for the last couple of quarters, with Chevron and Occidental Petroleum making up about 10% of his portfolio. Now, I think it's likely that Buffett is buying into Chevron and Occidental because of their presence in the Permian Basin, but the Permian Basin is the largest oil reserve on the planet. Looking over the activity for the Berkshire Hathaway portfolio for Q3 of 2023, there isn't a lot of activity. There are smaller activities that have likely been executed by his lieutenants, Todd Combs or Ted Westler. So to wrap it up, it is always interesting to see what the big guys are up to, although I didn't see any big news this quarter. For me personally, it was probably all of the super investors exiting Adobe, which is something that I have to think about. But I won't be making this video any longer today. I want to thank you for watching, and I will catch you on the next one.